what will be their concerns? What accommodations or arrangements can we ask? If they're not going to oblige, what are our carrots and our sticks? How do we lobby potential levers to pressure them to take certain steps? And mind you, everything that we ask is extremely reasonable. We can often get the desired outcomes if we are quite focused in getting those objectives.
Melting Pot, a global podcast series hosted by Payal, connects guests who have inspiring stories and reaches out to a multicultural audience over 52 countries. Guests are diverse, such as celebrities, entrepreneurs, travelers, and many more who've had a turning point in their lives and moved over to a holistic lifestyle. Follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, social media. Hi everyone. Today I am in conversation with the lovely Natasha Latiff. Natasha is an international human rights lawyer. She's also founder and co-director of Sahar, which is an organization that's resourcing women and diverse leaders who are shaping sexual and gender-based violence laws and policies. Natasha has over 10 years of experience. She's supported women who are human rights defenders and who are lawyers who actually represent women who are victims of abuse, rape, torture, and murder. And in 2023, and rightly so, Natasha was awarded with the Southeast Asia Women of the Future Awards. And this was more for her work in mentoring organizations and individuals on ESG matters. Thank you so much for joining me today, Natasha. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I would love for you to start off by telling me, my listeners, viewers, a little bit about your journey as a gender equality and human rights lawyer. How did that actually come about? What is it that motivated you to pursue this field of law?
Thank you, firstly, Payal, for having me. It's an honor to have to be on a podcast of someone like yourself, based in Singapore, with also a very diverse set of experience, and you having also traveled in different parts of the world. I very much believe in sharing the lessons learned that we pick up from different countries and communities, and that will guide us to become better people and better advocates of the causes that we believe in. And indeed, it was my first venture into Afghanistan that really shaped my perspective of the world, made me understand how the world works. Why are some people more vulnerable to human rights abuses than others? What makes them vulnerable? And looking at those conditions and factors and thinking about how are systems designed to support them, as well as how are systems designed to exploit them and disempower them. And with this knowledge, I decided to study law, which I've done up to the master degree level. I'm also qualified to practice in Singapore as an advocate and solicitor. And the purpose of getting into law is to really think about law is just its language. It's putting words together to say something is wrong or something is bad, and when liability can be found. I believe in the power of words and how we choose our words to describe certain acts as crimes, as offenses, as wrongs is very important. That's the way in which we recognize when a community is suffering from harm, that we don't consider it as collateral or part of life, but rather as a misconduct stemming from an individual or an institution or a system of practices that may not be malicious, but it's just that life is so that certain forms of discrimination and treatment is normalized, and we've got to put a spotlight on it so that we as people, as human beings, as companies, as governments, can really understand and open our eyes to things that we see as normal, but which are not normal, which are devastating lives and communities.
If you could just elaborate a little bit more on what exactly is gender equality and what does it mean to you and what does it look like in practice?
Yes, that's an excellent question and a very difficult one. I believe even the most tried and tested practitioners are figuring out what gender equality looks like in practice. I put myself in situations, well, I've operated in countries and situations where there's no rule of law. There's high levels of poverty. There's potential conflict, or countries are transitioning from totalitarian state to democracy. Societies and communities are in constant flux, and women occupy different positions in these places, and therefore may look at equality from a very different viewpoint. I, as an urban woman who's had the benefit of education and of employment and see the benefits of that, if I were to go into a rural setting and say what equality is the right of education and the right to go to work and the right to, it may not sit in the same way as it does for me in a rural community. In conflict settings, the right of freedom, the right to move about is not something that can be taken lightly, because security is an issue. And therefore, when a person asks me what is gender equality, I often say it is what a woman in a particular setting, considering the parameters, the restrictions, the limitations, and opportunities of that context, is what she and her community defines as equality. And for some women, like, the right to give birth in sanitary settings is more important than the right to employment. I don't think rights compete with each other necessarily. I think they all compound to increase well-being and welfare of an individual. But in some countries and contexts, you do choose and you do decide what rights are more important. And oftentimes you have to relegate certain rights to the back burner for the time being in order to obtain other rights. So I would say that, think about Indigenous women, their right to their land, the respect that they have with the mother nature. I can never comprehend that. I may think, yes, building a factory and getting employment for women is more important than the right to the source of water, to the source of land. And so we have different perspectives of what our rights are as women.
So what role do you think the legal profession will play or does play in advancing gender equality and human rights on a more systemic level?
Yes, I do believe that lawyers have a very important role to play, but they are not the be-all and end-all of things. I think sometimes lawyers can get a bit carried away about their expertise. And I often like to break the myth that laws should be written by lawyers. Sometimes I believe in consultation with communities, that they should participate in defining the law and defining what are avenues of justice, what justice means to them. We look at the laws that we've inherited in Singapore from the British system. Back then, it's very punitive in nature. So it's not restorative, it's not rehabilitative. Of course, things have changed since, but certain communities put more and privilege values such as restoration, restitution, forgiveness, repentance over punishment, so to speak. Their system of justice, if you go to a community, whether it's in rural Kenya or in Afghanistan, the way they take decisions is they sit in a circle, like a council, they sit in a circle, whereas in a formal court, you have a judge that's a mile away from you, sitting on a much higher position. And perhaps each has its own function, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is that as lawyers, we've got to adopt and understand plural ways of justice, of systems. But from my point of view, like in terms of my own work, I work with governments and institutions and companies. So these particular entities are touch points of the lives of hundreds and thousands of people. You think about the corporations make up more than two-thirds of the top economies of the world. They are nation states of its own, like they impact the lives of hundreds of people. What I do as a lawyer is I look at the dynamics of power imbalances and how abuses can happen. What are the dynamics that make people vulnerable? and then work with institutions to see, I'm always going back to the community's perspectives, affected person's perspective. So we're not drafting laws and policies top down. These are the best practice standards. Those standards are reference points, but we've got to ask the community, how do you access justice? What does justice mean to you? What does restitution mean to you? What do you prefer out of this situation? What are your preferences? What's stopping you? What are you afraid of? Retaliation, reprisals, loss of work, loss of education, and building in place systems and policies to tackle the root causes of why someone won't even report in the first place if they're encountering something that's considered to be a serious violation. The role of law is actually to sit and listen to communities and then to put their words into frameworks, policies, law, standards that then institutions like companies and governments can then get on board with.
How do you think, in terms of us looking ahead, the progress and the advancements in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, both legally as well as socially?
I believe we've progressed quite a bit. New laws have been passed. Out of those laws, policies have been developed. They've been catered.
And you're referring to this on a global level?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Who is actually responsible for it?
Many entities. It can start from ground up or it can start from top down. So top down would be, for example, we have the United Nations, different conventions that protect women's rights. Out of those conventions, committees are part, like the CEDAW committee passes general recommendations on gender-based violence, and they touch on specific forms of gender-based violence as well. And by passing these recommendations, these general comments, these guidelines, what we're just doing is setting the standards for how we define sexual violence and how we define what victims' rights are when they face sexual violence and what government and other non-state actors' roles are in preventing that from happening or catching or mitigating the impact of it. The norms and standards are there. Of course, there can be tweaks and development to ensure that they cater to marginalized communities. For example, disabled women probably face sexual violence very differently. Lesbian women face a different form of sexual violence. Women in prison face a different form of sexual violence. And so there can be more nuance in the way in which we capture those dynamics for even more marginalized people. But that is those standards are being shaped by organizations like Sahar, like coalitions, there are regional platforms and networks that lobby and they push for new resolutions and guidelines to be passed. The problem always comes down to implementation. Take, for example, the example that I gave you when I'm facing a company where there are mass reports of sexual violence and not one wants to make a complaint without hiding behind anonymity. And when you hide behind anonymity, company cannot deal with that complaint. The accused person needs to be able to confront the allegations. So there are all these challenges. And then within the systems, there are barriers to language. Some women, you think about global supply chains, women in the garment factories, they don't even know their own basic right. How are they to articulate that they've been wronged? Third is if they've grown up in communities and in families where they've been subordinated, forms of violence and discrimination is normal to them. So they won't even realize that they've been wronged. If they realize that they've been wronged, they don't have the social power or the power within the company to speak up against it. They can't even rely on their colleagues who are afraid that if they align with the survivors, their jobs will also be at risk. The channels of communication they don't trust, or they come from countries or communities where law is used to disempower people, so they may not trust complaint channels. This is the issues of implementation. And what organization, I have a consulting company called Fair Future in Singapore. What we do is we work with companies to diagnose the root causes, the blockages that beautiful laws, policies, standards on its own is not going to self-actualize. Certain things need to happen, and we really need to see remedy from the point of view of the survivor, the point of view of the common worker, the lady that's making the clothes in the factories, the man who's out in the factories assembling things in the manufacturing plant. If we don't see recourse through their viewpoint, then how can we design systems that's going to encourage reporting? So you'll see in most nations, sexual violence, gender-based violence, but also forced labor, child labor, modern slavery are underreported. A person who goes through that will never, the likelihood of them reporting is very slim. So you've got to create systems to account for underreporting and figure out how to encourage reporting without jeopardizing lives and livelihoods.
Yeah. So what kind of an advice would you give to young aspiring lawyers who are interested in actually pursuing a career in human rights and gender equality?
I really would love to see more women, more Asian women, but also anybody from any underrepresented community, whether ethnic group or religious group and so on. And just people in Asia to take charge of their professional aspirations, but also to take charge of the cause that's endemic to our region. So sexual violence in all forms, in workplaces, within families, within public institutions, within companies and supply chains, and all kinds of labor exploitation is so common. It's over 40 million people are trapped in some form of modern slavery. We are sitting, we are sitting at the heart of it. What we don't have enough of is whether you call yourself a lawyer or a practitioner who understands the A to Z of these things and who are able to, there's this word which we use called intersectionality, which means you apply an intersectional perspective to a situation. What do I mean by this? Is that every human being is an intersection of identities. And it could be an intersection of vulnerable identities. So a physically abled woman like myself, I have different vulnerabilities than a disabled woman who's also a refugee, who's also stateless, who's also fatherless, who's also subjected to early marriage, right? So different women in different communities and different people generally have several intersections of vulnerability that compound their vulnerability. Rather than a one-fit-all approach, people who want to go into this field have to really dedicate themselves to understanding the social, political, economic, cultural, religious setups and dynamics of these places that make vulnerability compound in certain communities or in certain people. Why is this so important? When you understand this, then can you come up with solutions which are meaningful? So when I talk about international law, international standards, they are written by a group of oftentimes people who are well-educated, perhaps in academic circles, perhaps in political elite circles. Their life experience is so far removed from the people who are experiencing the violation.
Yeah.
So as a young lawyer or as a young practitioner, you're going to learn all of that. You're going to learn all the standards. And those are easy to memorize, regurgitate. You're going to pass your exams. You're going to do very well. But can you break out of these educational constraints and that blind you to real life lived experience of people? For this,
so what do you think is holding young people back in Asia to actually go ahead and get involved at a grassroots level to, like you said, to see what is actually happening ground level and to be getting involved in that? What do you think? Because you mentioned that you'd like more people in Asia to come forward. So what do you think is holding them back, or there is a hesitation in wanting to, there may be a passion, but they're not able to really convert it into,
Yes.
or have the courage to do that. So what do you think is holding, something did not hold you back. So there have to be more people like you, right? So where in, and I'm sure it must have been within your, sort of within your community, it must have been very hard for people to accept what you were doing because of fear of something happening to you or whatever it may be. So what do you think is the reason in general in Asia?
Perhaps when one graduates from law school, the common route is to go into the private sector, to work in a firm. And that route is so well defined. There's a process and it just happens. Whereas in this field, you got to carve the path of your own. And it's very uncertain. You really don't know how to get there, where to go. These paths are not clear. So that I think that uncertainty, in a way, I believe that the people who end up doing this path is people who can just overcome those uncertainties and fears and just believe that it's only by doing that you figure things out and you build your network and you build your expertise and your native knowledge. So the main advice I would give is just to try and chart your own path. Dabble in different experiences, work with big organizations, work with small organizations, do field work, do office work, write reports, and at the same time do advocacy. It's a mixed bag of work, and you can do it if you find it and work your way through it. And not everybody have to go to dangerous countries like Afghanistan. Like conflict zones are perhaps not ideal for a lot of people, and it's dangerous. It can affect you mentally, it can affect you physically. You risk your life to do the work, and some people don't have the stamina to take that. So why put yourself through that? But there are many other places that are not conflict zones that could still benefit from passion, competence, experience, and dedication. So I would say just try it out, and seek mentors amongst your networks. I'm so happy, for example, if a young person come and ask me, how do I chart my own path? I'm so happy to have a conversation. And I think a lot of people in my field are as well. Like we were in those shoes at one time.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Whoever's listening, I'm sure there is a takeaway for them from what you've just said. So thank you so much, Natasha. I really enjoyed talking to you, and it's very inspiring to, even for me, to hear what it is that gives, why you're so driven and what gives you that passion and determination to actually reach out to and be involved in human rights issues, which are so relevant. It's so important for more and more people like yourself to actually step in and help the people who are marginalized or the people who do not have a voice because of where they come from, for you to be able to support them and to be able to reach out to, essentially to be a voice for them and to help in bringing about policy changes. And because you're able to understand the sensitivity and the importance of how every individual has a right to live in a dignified manner, right? So I think that's so important. And that's my takeaway from this conversation that I've just had with you. So once again, thank you, Natasha. Keep up the good work. And I think it's very important what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Payal, for having me and for also sharing this work across with your audiences. I do hope that more young people will be driven to chart their own path and to find their way into this work, because we just need more people.
Yeah.
And certainly. So I thank you for this opportunity as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you. For more weekly conversations, do listen to Melting Pot on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts. Follow us on YouTube and on Instagram at Podcast Melting Pot. So until the next episode, this is Payal signing off.